Speaking of which, Beijing is hosting a very important visitor as we speak, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. It was a long overdue trip. The last US Secretary to visit China was Mike Pompeo. That was in 2018, so it's been 5 years. Blinken was supposed to visit in February, but that trip was postponed by the balloon saga. You may remember that story. We reported it. Chinese spy balloons were spotted over American skies. Washington shot down one of them and postponed the trip. Anyway, it's finally happening. Blinken had 3 important meetings in Beijing with President Xi Jinping, with Foreign Minister Qin Gang, and with top diplomat Wang Yi. How did the meetings go? Well, here's what President Xi Jinping said after meeting Antony Blinken.
The two sides have also made progress and reached agreement on some specific issues. This is very good.
So some progress and some agreement. I guess that was expected. You see, China-US ties have hit rock bottom. So the expectations from this visit were pretty low. Blinken's mission was to keep the lines of communication open to avoid any miscalculations. But for China, the big issue was Taiwan. President Xi told Antony Blinken that relationships should be based on mutual respect and sincerity. A bit rich coming from the expansionist in chief. Either way, the visit seems to have gone by without much fuss. Way better than the shouting contest in Alaska 2 years back. But let's come back to Washington. China will be a key issue when Biden and Modi talk. The US may not say it out loud, but they're locked in a Cold War with Beijing. The White House has a 2-part strategy. One is economic warfare, all the sanctions, the tariffs, the export controls. The idea is to weaken the Chinese economically, to take factories and jobs out of China. The second strategy is military deterrence. We've seen more US activity in the Indo-Pacific. Biden has also deployed more warships and submarines in the region, so the message is quite clear. The Indo-Pacific will not be a Chinese lake. Where does India figure in that plan? New Delhi is key to both these strategies, economic and military. Again, I come back to the question, will Prime Minister Modi agree to what Biden has in mind? Well, unlike the US, India shares a border with China, a long, contested and volatile border. The two armies faced off in the year 2020 in Galwan, and since then there's been a standoff. 38 months and no sign of de-escalation. We've been locked in a standoff with the Chinese for 38 months. Thousands of soldiers have been deployed on either side. Even a small miscalculation can be deadly. And Prime Minister Modi cannot ignore this border issue. He cannot push China beyond a point. The US, on the other hand, faces no such restrictions. They're sitting safe, thousands of miles away. We've seen this contrasting approach in the Quad as well. India has been reluctant to give the Quad a military color. Yes, there are joint exercises, but at its heart, the Quad is non-military. And don't get me wrong, India very much sees China as a growing threat. The only difference is in the approach. Will Joe Biden understand that? As things stand today, he may not really have a choice. At this stage, Biden cannot afford to antagonize India. So his only option is to play along. Having said that, he will be expecting something positive. In fact, let me walk you through some recent events. South Korea's president visited Washington in the month of April. And then last week, a US nuclear submarine docked in Korea. The Filipino president was also here in the US. He then granted the Americans access to multiple military bases. Last month, Antony Blinken traveled to Papua New Guinea. Biden was supposed to go, but he pulled out at the last moment, so Blinken went. Either way, the Americans got something out of Papua New Guinea. Unimpeded access to bases in Papua New Guinea. Now, do you see the trend here? The US has been busy in the Indo-Pacific. They've gotten what they wanted from these countries, from South Korea, from the Philippines, from Papua New Guinea. So will India be next? Well, Biden is certainly dangling the carrot. We mentioned the jet engines and the drones. That's part of a large US project to pump money and to pump technology into India. But what does America want in return? Probably a second front in the conflict against China. It's purely a self-serving policy. And how should India respond? Well, with some self-service of its own. Challenging China militarily does not make sense at this point. Neither does joining the US camp. Prime Minister Modi has repeatedly emphasized on strategic autonomy, on a multipolar world. He wants to challenge China, but on his own terms. So it's up to Biden to dehyphenate things, to see India as a partner, not a pawn. One thing is clear though, Joe Biden is betting big on this visit. Like all relationships, there is something in it for both sides. But one party seems to be more eager, and that is the American side. That's US President Joe Biden. Do you remember his campaign promise in 2020? He said America is back. From the looks of it, it's back to square one. Biden's foreign policy record does not look good as of today. He failed to revive the Iran nuclear deal. He failed to stop the Ukraine war. He's also losing allies in West Asia, which makes you wonder, where are the positives? Well, this visit could be one of them. If Biden can cement the India-US relationship, his legacy would be set. Because New Delhi is a big prize, the biggest democracy in the world. A major Indian Ocean power, which is also a nuclear-armed power. A leader of the global south. A historic partner of the Russians. You can't ignore India anymore. It's the fifth largest economy in the world. It offers you supply chain diversity and skilled labor. Joe Biden wants all of that. He knows that India is key to America's eventual showdown with China, whether it's taking away the factories or producing semiconductors or patrolling the Indo-Pacific. So what does the US president do? He lays out the big red carpet. If Biden can get India on board, he can sell it to his voters. He's facing re-election next year. And from the looks of it, he will take on Donald Trump. So it will be a repeat of the 2020 election. Although a lot has changed since then, President Biden has presided over a period of rising cost of living. He's also lost the US House of Representatives. His approval rating is around 40%, which is the lowest of his presidency. And Trump, on the other hand, is in legal trouble. He has been charged in 2 separate cases. So my point is, anything can happen. It's going to be a big contest. Biden may or may not be in the White House next year, so he's pulling out all the stops. There are 2 aspects to this strategy. Number one, the Indian-American pull. It's a huge community in the US, numbering more than 4 million. They're the second largest immigrant voting bloc. And most of them support Prime Minister Modi. You court the Prime Minister, you get their vote. At least that's the assumption. Donald Trump tried the same. In 2016, he released this campaign video.
Abhi ki bar, Trump Sarkar.
That was Prime Minister Modi's 2014 election slogan. Trump copied it, and it seems to have helped. Perhaps Biden is expecting similar results this time. The second aspect is strategic. I already mentioned what India brings to the table for the Americans. Yes, the defense deals and the tech transfer is great, but for Joe Biden, that is not the end goal. The end goal for him is political, to recruit India into the American camp. And that would really help him domestically too. Just think back to another American president, Richard Nixon, known for just 2 things. One is the Watergate scandal and his disgraceful exit from the White House. The second is his China policy. Richard Nixon began relations with the communist regime in China. He opened a second front against the Soviet Union. It played a crucial role in the Cold War, perhaps even contributed to the end of the Cold War. Joe Biden is trying to do something similar as president, to use India's popularity and strategic importance to benefit domestically. The question is, will Prime Minister Modi play that game? We ask because it's a dangerous one, especially because it's targeted at one country, China. At the core of India's engagements with the world is the idea of multi-alignment, engaging with different partners, maintaining strategic autonomy, not being boxed in any camp or alliance, and building a multipolar world. India is using its G20 presidency to further this agenda. India is pushing for what you could call a G21, a group that also has the African Union as a member. New Delhi has endorsed Africa's bid for membership. Now remember, the G20, or Group of 20, is an international forum. It has 19 countries and the EU, the European Union. And since the EU is already a part of the G20, another grouping like the African Union won't be unique. But its inclusion would be significant and timely. You see, for years, countries have complained about the G20, calling it a private club with no clear path to membership. Now, the Indian Prime Minister has made an appeal for Africa to make the group more inclusive and representative of the world. Here's a report.
The G20, a grouping that describes itself as the primary venue for international economic and financial cooperation. It's an exclusive grouping that makes decisions affecting the world, but it doesn't really allow the world to take part. Since it was conceived in 1999, the group's composition hasn't changed, even though the world has. The G20 has never inducted a new member. It has permanent guests like Spain, ASEAN and the African Union. But so far, the G20 hasn't given anyone membership. Now that could change thanks to India. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has written to the fellow G20 members. India wants to expand the G20 in the upcoming summit in New Delhi this September. By inducting the African Union, the AU is a grouping of 55 African states. It represents about 1.4 billion people and around 10% of the world's economy. You would think that a grouping of this size would be front and center at any global forum. But that's not the reality. The AU has marginal representation at the G20. Only one AU country is a permanent member of the group. That's South Africa. The rest of the AU countries are represented by the African Union delegate, who is a permanent guest, not a member. There's also representation from the African Union's Economic Development Program, the New Partnership for Africa's Development, or NEPAD. This organization too is a permanent guest at the G20. This year it's being represented by Egypt. So, to recap, 1.4 billion people and a tenth of the world's economy is represented by one permanent member and two guests. Let's compare this to the European representation. The EU is a member of G20, and there are 5 European countries who are members in their own capacity: Germany, France, Italy, Turkey and the UK. Spain is also a permanent guest to the G20. So, 6 permanent seats and 1 guest represent Europe, a region with half of Africa's population. That does seem ridiculous, and the world has been waking up to this of late. Last year, Indonesia proposed the AU's membership to the G20 ahead of November's summit in Bali. Indonesia was the chair of the G20 last year. During the Bali summit, French President Emmanuel Macron backed the AU. AU membership was endorsed by China and lobbied for by South Africa. But what came of it? Nothing. There was no mention of the AU's membership in the G20 declaration after the Bali summit. So, does that mean that India's endorsement won't move the needle either? We have to wait for the summit to know for sure, but there is one crucial difference. The AU has 2 new powerful allies this time around. There's of course the hosts, India, and then there's also the US. Last December, days after the Bali summit, US President Joe Biden gave his nod to AU membership.
And today I'm also calling for the African Union to join the G20 as a permanent member of the G20.
Biden said this during a US-Africa summit in Washington. Was Biden's declaration substantial or just sweet nothings? We're likely to find out in September. India has already put its endorsement in writing. Will others follow its lead? We'll keep you updated as this story develops.
Now to the war in Ukraine. The fighting has intensified and there are reports of heavy casualties. This is the fallout of Ukraine's much talked about counter-offensive. It's been on for about 2 weeks now. Kiev claims 8 villages have been liberated from Russian occupation. These are primarily in 2 directions, the eastern Donetsk region and the southern Zaporizhia. Ukraine says it's slowly but steadily making progress. But Russia seems to have dug its heels in. Moscow says the Ukrainians are suffering heavy casualties as they try to make their way forward. Here's the latest.
Today, on the 18th of June, the forces of 128 Assault Brigade and the 2nd Separate Rifle Battalion chased out the Russians. The Russians ran away, leaving equipment and ammunition. Glory to Ukraine.
Ukraine's military released this video on social media yesterday. The troops claim to have liberated a village from Russian control. The troops are waving the yellow and blue flag and shouting "Glory to Ukraine." But the celebrations could have been premature. The village's name, Piatikatki, roughly translates to 5 houses. It's quite small, and it may not even be in Ukraine's hands. While a Russian official acknowledged that Pyatikhatki village has been retaken by Ukraine, but the official also claimed that Kyiv's troops were later pushed out of the village. Russia says the village is now in a grey area of control. And this disputed liberation reportedly came at a high price. Russian military bloggers say that both Ukraine and Russia suffered heavy losses around the village, both in terms of soldiers and equipment. Moscow keeps announcing Ukrainian casualty numbers.
Over 200 Ukrainian servicemen, 33 tanks, 30 infantry fighting vehicles, and 35 armored fighting vehicles were destroyed in the course of hostilities in the Zaporizhia direction alone in a day.
Russia maintains that Ukraine's counteroffensive is faltering. It doesn't talk much about its own losses, though. The British Defence Ministry has been monitoring the war. It says both countries are suffering high casualties. It also says that Ukraine's gains have been small. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky himself acknowledged the difficulties his troops are facing, especially around Zaporizhia.
It is high time to express our gratitude to all our warriors, to those who have distinguished themselves this week. The Tavria direction is the most brutal one.
The word Tavria refers to the southern front. Zelensky called it brutal, but despite the brutality, he doesn't seem disheartened. He even issued a warning to Russia.
Russia will lose the captured territories. There is no and will be no alternative to our steps towards deoccupation. Our troops are advancing, position by position, step by step. We are moving forward.
This means the war is about to enter another prolonged, deadly phase. No matter the cost, Zelensky seems determined to go through with the counteroffensive. A lot of people on both sides will end up losing their lives, and there might not be many pieces left to pick up. Despite this, Ukraine is already planning its recovery. It wants a green Marshall Plan to rebuild its economy. This is a reference to the aftermath of World War II. Under the original Marshall Plan, the US transferred billions to Western Europe to help it rebuild. Ukraine wants a new green version of that. Green how? Kyiv plans to rebuild its destroyed industries in a sustainable manner. The focus is on steel. Ukraine says its destroyed steel plants will be rebuilt and powered by renewable energy. As part of this Green Marshall Plan, Kyiv has asked for $40 billion. This request will be debated in London on Wednesday. Ukraine and Britain are co-hosting a two-day meeting there. But any decision on this will most likely come into effect only after the war is over. And $40 billion is just an initial request. The World Bank estimates that Ukraine's reconstruction will cost $411 billion. So it's a long road ahead for Ukraine. And the first step to rebuilding is the toughest one. The war has to end.
Meanwhile, away from all the diplomacy and global power play, a Bollywood film is making a splash. Not in a way that its makers would like it to, but that's how it is. I'm talking about Adi Purush, a film inspired by Ramayana. Adi Purush has been in the middle of controversy from the word go. And the latest one came from Nepal, India's neighbor. Two Nepalese cities, including the capital city of Kathmandu, have released fresh orders. They've banned the screening of all Bollywood films in their cinemas, and Adi Purush has been banned across Nepal. So what is this controversy about? And why has it escalated? Our next report tells you.
This is Adi Purush, an Indian Hindi film, inspired by the Hindu epic Ramayana. It depicts the victory of the Hindu god Ram over the demon king Ravana, after the latter kidnaps his wife Sita, who is the female protagonist of the Ramayana. Now, one thing is important to remember here. Nepal, the landlocked South Asian country, prides itself on its connection to Sita, who is believed to hail from Janakpur in Nepal, where her father, King Janak, had his kingdom. And because of her roots, Sita is also known as Janki, meaning the daughter of Janak. And this is what Sita is called in Adipurush as well. Her character's name is Janki in the movie. Even so, a dialogue refers to her as the daughter of India. And this has been the root of a controversy in Nepal. especially as Hindus make up about 80% of the country's population. So initially Kathmandu, the Nepalese capital, issued directives saying that Bollywood films will not be screened in the city until this quote-unquote objectionable line is deleted from the movie. And this protest is being spearheaded by this man, Balendra Shah. He's the mayor of Kathmandu. Some 3 days ago, he had given an ultimatum to the makers of Adipurush, demanding that the controversial dialogue be deleted. He called it misleading. But when the desired change wasn't made, he said, "Defense of Nepal's sovereignty, independence and self-respect is the first duty of all Nepalese governments, non-governmental organizations and Nepalese citizens." Then, Shah proceeded to halt the release of all Bollywood movies. But this anger against Adipurush has spread like wildfire in the country. It began with Kathmandu, and by today morning, Pokhara had followed suit. Now, both the cities have banned Indian Hindi movies. And across the nation, Adipurush screenings have been barred, including in Dharan, Itahari, Janakpur, Dhangadhi and Chitwan. But Adipurush's fight against controversy is even bigger in its home country, India. Now, Adipurush is one of the most expensive movies to be made in India. It's also mired in controversy. The film started making headlines months ago when its trailer was released. Viewers mocked cartoon-like graphics and drew similarities to Western shows like Game of Thrones. The depiction of Ramayana's characters in the movie, especially the portrayal of Hanuman, faced the ire of critics, and Adipurush kicked off a political storm where, across the ideological spectrum, many leaders came forward to protest the film. There were reports of sporadic protests against the movie. But now, anger is crossing national boundaries onto Nepal, adding to a list of disputes between the two countries, like the unresolved Kalapani territorial dispute or the Akhand Bharat mural in the new Parliament of India, which was criticized by Nepalese leaders. And now, Nepal's ties with India may be further strained because of a movie that is making waves not only in India, but also abroad. Just not in the manner one would expect.
And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. Indonesia and SpaceX have launched a telecommunications satellite. This project is worth over $500 million. It aims to provide internet access to remote corners of Indonesia. In the United States, a huge funnel cloud formed over a town in Oklahoma amid tornado warnings. We'll show you a time-lapse video. In Germany, a Spanish motorcycle racer crashed for the 5th time during a warm-up race. And finally, what makes the 19th of June significant? We're taking you back in history. In 1865, Texas, it's a state in America, on this day, a group of enslaved African Americans learned that they were free from slavery. Their president was Abraham Lincoln. Over 2 years back, he had signed a landmark law. It's called the Emancipation Proclamation. It was meant to free all the slaves. This day is also called Juneteenth. It's a federal holiday here in the US. We're leaving you with this. Thank you for watching. We'll see you tomorrow from Washington, D.C.